Right, hello everyone, very loud. Alright, welcome everyone. Thanks for escaping the wet and cold to be here tonight in Melbourne. It's a testament to how rich our film culture is that we can basically pack Thornbury Picture House on a cold and wet Tuesday night, so thanks. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend that welcome to any First Nations people in the audience tonight. I'm Bill Masulis tonight, so forgive me if I'm not doing the best job. Bill normally carries the reins here, but unfortunately he can't come down from Adelaide. But welcome everybody to Anne Turner's CELIA. Anne has really interested me since I saw her 2006 film Irresistible, starring Susan Sarandon and Emily Blunt and a bunch of other Aussies that I'm sure we can talk about in the Q&A. And I think the critical reception was a bit misguided, and I think there was a really interesting interest in like paranoia, both in that film, and I was really keen to screen CELIA for that reason. And I'll pass it on to Anne to introduce herself. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Digby. Thanks for having me here. And thank you all for coming out on this very cold and wet night to see CELIA, which was my first feature film that I made after I was at film school at Swinburne. I graduated in 1981. I made CELIA. We shot it over a very long summer holiday in 1987. And I loved working with the kids. I had a great cast and crew for a first feature. It was just amazing. And Rebecca Smart in the starring role of CELIA, I think, is a truly amazing performance from a child. So I really hope you enjoy the film and look forward to speaking afterwards in a Q&A with Digby. Thanks very much.
Thanks guys, enjoy the film. Give it up for Anne and CELIA. Thanks, Anne.
You should be able to reach that. I think I'm
yeah,
leaning on it like the rabbit on the fence.
Is it too high?
I might fall off.
We can stand. I thought it's not something I wrote in the questions I sent you, but I had a question about the screenplay while we were watching, and it dawned on me that Alice and CELIA are anagrams of one another, maybe.
Oh, I never really thought of that.
And there's quite a lot of parallels, maybe. And the man in the like fictionalized movie that they watched in the theatre, Maslin,
No, not Sue.
No, but it's
Mike Mayfield.
Mike Mayfield, sorry, yeah. He has this thing where he stares at the camera and he says something like, we're all looking for the truth or something. And I think that it's a really interesting film in that everyone's kind of concealing the truth from one another to sort of, for posterity and for safety in a way. And I suppose I'm just asking, as a screenwriter, where this all stemmed from, and particularly Alice feels like quite a lived-in character, and so does CELIA. They seem like quite strong characters, yeah.
Well, CELIA was very much based on my childhood, and I wanted to tell the story through the eyes of a child because it had the rabbit plague and the Balti government rabbit muster and communists, but I wanted to tell that story of the Red Scare through a child's eyes. And so CELIA was very much part of my childhood coming into it, and my friends, and certainly the gang wars, we had those. We did run around all summer long and do some fairly terrible things. We did make traps, but in the sand at the beach. We'd cover them with driftwood and seaweed and stay up and listen and wait and hear people fall in them. So we did do that sort of thing. And
with
so
the
it's
worms?
The maggots, no, that was sort of just research of dead meat and what would happen. No, we didn't do that. We didn't go that far. But I certainly had a person who caused me a lot of grief, a family friend, who Stephanie was very much based on. And when I watched it tonight, my memory of her came back. She terrorised me and would always sort of call out to her mother and get me in trouble when she was doing the terrible things. So there was a lot of my childhood put into the script.
And like, I know you've probably heard this before, but I recently rewatched Stand By Me, and that's a film that kind of recontextualises the 50s and the 80s. But it seems like a decade where politics was perhaps more clear-cut. I'm not sure, I'm kind of generalising, but I suppose the backdrop of the Communist Party and Alice serves as one of the many kind of conflicts of the film. You've got the rabbit, Stephanie, Alice, Communist Party, Ray, and I'm wondering if that's something that appealed to you about the 50s, perhaps.
The politics were very clear cut, I suppose, in terms of the Red Scare.
Yeah.
And of course it was post-war and very close to the war. And I think, again, when I was watching tonight, the men have the rage that they came back. A lot of men came back who'd been prisoners of war, and they did have that sort of rage, and they did bring children up screaming at them a lot and telling them off, and they thought that was protecting them. And Ray, of course, is quite conflicted in the film because he's also got the left-wing background.
Quite loving as well with the fishing scene.
He's very loving and loves her and wants to protect her as his daughter, but also faced terrible prejudice and embarrassment growing up to a socialist, communist mother. And so he's trying to protect Celia from that. So that's his worst fear when the neighbours come next door and they're members of the Communist Party. And he's also gone to war and come back very right-wing and probably became more right-wing as a child, being very embarrassed by his mother's politics. And so I think there's that rage in him, that's the double rage of hating his background, wanting to protect Celia, being furious at the neighbours next door, but then drawn to Alice. So he's a very complex character. And Alice is someone who I think is just very warm and loving and has gone through a political journey of her own, as so many communists did in that time, because the Hungarian uprising meant that a lot of communists were in Australia losing heart in the Communist Party. And they were very idealistic people, a lot of them. So the Australian Peace Council was very much fighting for, or wanting peace. And so it wasn't the sort of image of communists we probably have now. It was a very different time. But with the Hungarian uprising and Stalinism, there was a huge upheaval in the Communist Party in Australia, and that's what the Tanners are going through. And that's based on a friend's story. And when I first got the idea for this, I was reading an article about the rabbit muster, the Baltic government's rabbit muster, and how insane that was that he got everyone to take their rabbits to the zoo. And then even Conservative parents protested so loudly they had to reverse the decision because they were going to lose votes. And there was absolute chaos. And in fact, there was so much chaos that when we shot it, the zoo wouldn't give us permission even.
Was that the convent again
80s.
From Irresistible? The same location?
Yes, it is.
I thought it was.
Yes, it's the Abbotsford Convent.
Yeah.
So we mocked that up as
Emily
Melbourne
wants
Zoo.
a little Christian at the end of Irresistible.
That's right. So I use it twice in my films.
It's really fun.
But yeah, so the zoo wouldn't let us film them even in the 1980s. Because it was still so touchy of the terrible chaos and mess and rabbit deaths. And so basically Alice, I think again has a big journey as a character because she's going through that disillusionment and then she's got this neighbour coming onto her all the time. And so there's that whole sort of sexual tension and the way Ray behaves. I mean, it's so inappropriate. And so there's a lot going on under the surface, and I guess that's what I was getting at as a scriptwriter, in thinking the 50s were a time, and I think the 60s were too, where things were swept under the carpet all the time. Things weren't confronted, that there was a lot of repression. And that, to me as a scriptwriter, is what I wanted to talk about, that Celia's had all these losses and everything's repressed and then it bursts out.
Yeah, I think that's testament to how you sort of finish the film with this tragic act. I mean, I would argue that it's uncertain whether it actually happened or not, or whether Celia facilitated the killing. That's sort of my interpretation, but maybe that would be a good launching pad to talk about this notion of the aesthetic of paranoia.
Yes.
And, which is something that I've written about from the late 70s, 80s era of Australian films, where, paranoia is the notion of distrust that one may have of those around them, or where a situation is either neutral or positive and you can only ever frame it as negative or horrifying, no matter what evidence is given against that. And I think there's a lot of examples throughout the film, but quite early on when she starts hallucinating Granny, I think the framing of the story where Alice, it's kind of suburban Melbourne, and Ray mentions at the barbecue that he kind of grew up doing foxing or something at the neighbours, and it's like the quarry's it's undeveloped, but it's just a reservation of land and the creek, and I think that part of this is what makes the aesthetic of paranoia quite unique to Australia, is this sense that we're all trying to make ourselves belong to some extent. And I just wondered if you could talk about Granny in relation to Celia, perhaps early on.
Yes, and also the whole thing of paranoia, your interesting theory about Australian films of that era, the 70s and then the 80s. And I think it is interesting. I mean, the 50s were a very paranoid time.
Yeah.
And people were really frightened of Reds under the bed, and that terrible things were going to happen if people were allowed to be members of the Communist Party. And so basically, I think that paranoia was very much part of the story. And then Celia is a sensitive child undergoing terrible loss that people aren't understanding. And I think the parents become more understanding of how affected Celia is by loss as the film goes on, after the rabbit gets taken. But I think the paranoia that you mentioned, yes, I mean, Celia she's dealing with loss, and she's terrified of Hobyahs. She's terrified of things in the night coming to snatch Granny away, snatch her away, and that is very paranoid. So I think paranoia does come into it, and I certainly like not just Australian films of the 70s with paranoia, but a great film, and that's coming on here soon, Don't Look Now. It's a wonderful film about paranoia, I think, and loss.
Yeah.
And so I think perhaps paranoia and loss come together a bit too.
Yeah, perhaps it's the idea that you don't want to believe that the thing's lost yet.
Yes, I think very much so.
That's where the paranoia stems from.
Very much so, very much. And I think Celia's at that liminal age, at 9 years old, where she's a child, but she's starting to understand adult things. But then she's not understanding the death of her granny at all, and she's a sensitive child, and she's terrified of the dark, as was I.
That's too. Did you get night terrors?
I did, and I had two very naughty older sisters who went out one night when they weren't allowed to, and I was always terrified of turning on a light in the middle of the night, that I'd see a Hobyah or something awful. And one night I heard noises coming through my window, and I actually mustered up the courage to turn on the light, and there was a set of legs dangling from the top of the windows when you took down, coming in at me. And I screamed so loudly, my parents came running. It was, of course, one of my sisters climbing through the window. But that sort of drew my night terror. Like, I still remember it because I was so frightened of that happening, and then it did.
That sounds awful. But that brings me to the Hobyah, which, doing a bit of reading, sounds like it was a Scottish folktale that might have made its way to America, and then it was popularised in the 1920s in the Victorian school curriculum. And I was just saying to you before the screening that hangman's been like made illegal at school now. So I can't imagine them reading Hobyah.
I know. Well, actually, by the 1950s, the Hobyahs were banned in the school reader in Victoria. But I grew up in Adelaide in the 1960s, and the Hobyahs were very much in our school reader. And it was wonderful because every story, you got 3 words that were going to be important words for you to learn in life. And one of those words in the Hobyahs was Hobyah, which strikes me as a ridiculous word that children needed to learn. So the whole thing was really crazy. But we loved the story. We were terrified of it, but we also loved it. And it was always the favourite that we'd ask the teacher to read. And that image where little dog Turpie gets chopped up and put on a shelf, that's actually from the real reader. And it just stuck in my mind, yeah. It's a terrible image for children. And we all remember it. When I have school reunions, go to school reunions, we all remember that dog chopped up. But I turned the Hobyahs, they were sort of pink fetal creatures in the original, and I turned them blue to represent the police as well.
Yeah, and Balti's face is coloured blue at the end.
I only was just allowed to do that. There was a big kerfuffle just before we shot of whether we could do it or we'd be sued. Oof. And I was like, I've got to do this. This is a key image.
Yeah.
And we shot it with the, well, look, if we have to take it out. I thought, I don't quite know what I'd do if we had to, but luckily we got to keep it in. And that's the sort of thing as a filmmaker, like people panic and you have to sort of keep going. Even the last scene actually, right at the end of the cut, some powers that be got cold feet about the hanging scene. And I was under a lot of pressure to take it out, and I really had to fight for it because to me it's a different film without it. Like that is absolutely the key image of the film.
This is sort of a more contextual question that I've been meaning to ask, but that, I recently screened Richard Lowenstein's Evictions from 1980, and noticed that he got a mention in your Flesh on Glass student short from 1981.
Yes.
But I'm just riffing more on the Swinburne scene of the late 70s with people like John Hillcoat and yourself and Richard and Paul Goldman and Jeff Wright, and I think it would seem like quite a really prodigious time. Was there something in the air, or was it a teacher? Or?
I think we had really good lecturers.
Yeah.
I had Peter Tammer, who was fantastic, whose last film screened here recently, I believe.
Yeah.
And he came from very much an independent filmmaking background, an experimental filmmaking background. And I think that was incredibly important for us because he encouraged us to take risks. He encouraged things not to be a Hollywood version of things and much more European, but also just really pushed us to do things out of the box. And something with CELIA, I think that's interesting, is doing that. It had a very hard time finding an audience because it doesn't fit into a genre neatly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think that's what's given it such a long life.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those paradoxical things, but I feel very privileged we had Peter Tammer and lecturers like that who were very experimental, very radical, showed us a lot of radical films, and just nice experimental forms of filmmaking. So the credits at the start, this was shot on 35mm film, and so special effects weren't like special effects now, so they had to be physically done. And so that was step printed, which meant you had to take a frame of the film and repeat it over and over as a special effect. So we learnt all those sort of techniques because he was an experimental filmmaker teaching us. And so I used those in CELIA very much.
Yeah, that's I love that opening scene, particularly the recurring soundtrack score. I might just ask one more question and throw it to the audience. I was interested with the recurring location of the cinema, which my partner Megan guessed might be the Rivoli.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Spot on.
Nice. I just wondered, because we've recently George Miller's been making Furiosa. He's kind of spoken about growing up in rural Queensland and attending, the cinema was like a church. It was a far different landscape in the 50s and 60s. I just wondered if there's any kind of attachment that you have with the physical space of the cinema.
Oh, absolutely. We had a beautiful cinema in Adelaide called the Chelsea Cinema that's now renamed, and it was like the Rivoli, very much like the Rivoli. And I'd go there every Saturday and we'd watch serials. So there was a thing called The Skull, which was in black and white. And The Skull came on and it was an adventure series. And we also had Dick Tracy, and that's the Mike Mayfield character's meant to be like Dick Tracy. Yeah. And then we'd watch various films. And again, one of my naughty older sisters took me to the Chelsea when I was far too young and took me to horror films.
Cool.
And I'm still terrified by what I saw. And I remember seeing Spielberg's Jewel and terrified of that too.
The
at
car,
the Chelsea,
like,
the truck. Yeah. So, no, I have very fond memories of the Chelsea.
This is going to be my last question, but that might lead me to ask about how you feel about CELIA's kind of rediscovery as a sort of a horror film, which it sounds as if you never really perhaps intended when you first wrote it.
No.
But is this something that's welcoming, or...?
Oh, I think it's really interesting. I was very influenced by horror films as a filmmaker. So I grew up watching awful movies with Deadly Earnest on television, and there are a lot of horror films. I mean, they're all horror films, Body Snatchers and things like that. And that's where I saw Curse of the Cat People. And that was a huge influence on Celia. So that's a child who's had terrible loss and has an imaginative life and is terrified of the Headless Horseman, and so that was a big influence on me, that film. And also Carnival of Souls, the music in Carnival of Souls. And I got Chris Neal, who I think did a splendid job with the score, to get that sort of carnivalesque tone through it. And so certainly a lot of the influence for me was from horror films. But I didn't think I was making a horror film, I thought I was making a political film. And I think the interesting thing is, in recent years when it's had releases on Blu-ray and DVD, it's fitted into both those categories. So Second Run, a terrific company in the UK, has put it out on DVD and Blu-ray, and they do really Eastern European political films. And in fact, I was the only director of all their people who hadn't gone to jail for my beliefs. And then recently Severin, an American company, has put it out as a horror movie.
Yeah.
And that's brought a huge new audience to it.
Well, any questions in the audience? Yep, Kevin?
Thanks, Digby.
Yeah, do you need the mic?
I think I can get away.
Okay.
I'm not sure everyone can hear me. And if we take the film, in the end, literally of the policeman dying, did you have any censorship issues with the ending and her essentially getting away with it?
No, that's a really good question. No, we didn't have a censorship issue for that. In England, we did have to answer a censor's question, and that was over the rabbit branding. And that was all done, of course, with special effects. And it was the rod is actually hollow, and it had tape around it of that reflective material, like on the rods actually, and a red light shone, so it looked hot. And then through the hollow part, steam was put through a smoke to come out looking like it was burning, and the rabbit's hair was cut very gently by the rabbit, had its rabbit handler there all the time, and they cut a little cross. And so of course the rabbit wasn't hurt at all, and the sound effects were put on later as sound effects. I don't think they're even a rabbit, I think there's someone making rabbit noises. So basically, the dog was too. So basically, the censor in England wanted to make sure that we weren't completely perverse convicts in Australia who branded a rabbit.
Yeah, Das.
I like 3 questions.
Oh.
What do the rabbits represent for you? And would you say Ray is a bit of a rabbit? And thirdly, where was the quarry shot?
I'll do the last one first. The quarry was around Mount Waverley. Not there anymore. But it was perfect. And Ray is a rabbit. That's really interesting because in some ways he is, because he wants to conform. And so, but I hadn't thought of, I mean, I wasn't intending Ray to be a rabbit. And the rabbits came up because of the original story of the Baltic government rabbit muster. And I'd also had a pet rabbit that met a horrible, untimely death at the hands of a dog that broke in and knocked its cage lid open and killed it when I was at school. So I had this traumatic experience. So I guess I put that in as well when I chose rabbits. But it was from that rabbit muster story that really was the central idea. And I think one thing with script writing, I know Chris McGill at Swinburne had a theory about key images, that you have a key image in a film. And that rabbit muster, when she goes, and there are hundreds of rabbits and hundreds of kids and no one knows whose is whose, was always the key image as I wrote it.
So it was sort of like, how do I get there?
Exactly.
Yeah, I also thought the image of Alice's mum with the newspaper was like, I wish I could see that prop of the news story saying that Balti's burn got lifted.
Yeah, and I think I took a lot of that. Some I made up, but some I took from the headlines, from the actual papers.
Yeah.
So I went and researched it, and there was a lot of talk about new Australians breeding pet rabbits to eat. That was one of the reasons that Balti gave also to ban pet rabbits.
Have you seen how much it costs to buy rabbits to eat now per kilo?
No, I wouldn't. I can't eat rabbit.
Killing chicken and beef is a joke.
I'm glad it is. I don't like people eating rabbits. But it's interesting. I think now you're probably getting this debate around cats, dare I say it, where not people eating them, but in terms of a cat's pests or pets, and delineating between wild cats in the country, feral cats, which of course are a terrible problem, like the rabbits were, and pet cats. And some people, I mean a lot of people actually are starting to conflate the two. So it's interesting how there are waves of what gets attacked in terms of animals and pets.
I think also in Australia we love to think we're like a really like collective society, but then individuals have to cop everything, like transferring from gas to electricity and everything. Like we're a very kind of bottom-up country, I think, in terms of reform. I'm just generalising, but might relate also to the cat thing.
Yeah.
Like we somehow think that that's like a solution.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting where cats, like cats are now treated as foreign enemies, really, and have curfews and of course. So, yeah, I suppose back then it was pet rabbits, and people did have a lot of pet rabbits in the 50s. Like, it was a very common pet.
Maybe Jacinta Allen will make an announcement tomorrow. Any more questions? Yeah, Kit.
I was wondering, the Hobyah all the sequences of the Hobyahs was like quite intense and like scary compared to what is, like you said, it's political film. It's kind of like a coming of age film in a sense as well. Did you get any offers for like CELIA 2, like the Hobyah? Any kind of like reinterpretation? Because it was so intense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I travelled with it around the world at film festivals, and people often said, would there be a CELIA 2 or a sequel of when Celia grew up? And then people would say, what do you think Celia will be when she grows up? And I always thought a politician.
Well, she says she wants to be a lawyer with her father.
Yeah, I think she'd be a politician from what she's learned, where she's ended up.
Yeah. Did you get any Hollywood offers? Like between Celia and Hammers on the Anvil?
I got an American agent, and I got scripts, and I didn't like any of the scripts. And then I just kept making films in Australia, basically.
I meant to ask...
Because the scripts were, they just... I guess, again, from my training at Swinburne, it was very much you made films from the heart.
Yeah.
And so the scripts that I got were very much... my heart couldn't have been in them, and so I didn't pursue any of them. Yeah,
it's interesting to note that a lot of those directors have kind of stuck pretty local as well.
Yeah,
like
I think...
Paul Goldman.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, John Hillcoat went have a sense, of course, but But yeah, it's interesting. It was a very different education than the one at AFTRS in Sydney, and it probably is a bit of a Melbourne-Sydney divide, really, of when we went through anyway. The film school here was not training people. They were training filmmakers, not television, and they were training people to have their vision and be much more like the French New Wave, the German New Wave. I mean, they were the influences, not Hollywood.
I lost my question. I had a question. Yeah, we've got a question. So, yeah.
The performances of the kids are utterly extraordinary.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the process of working with Rebecca, but with all of the kids, rehearsal, how you got those performances?
Yeah, the kids are amazing. And what I did was I was looking for kids who had a good concentration level, because when you have two kids reading against each other, kids who don't have that really good concentration, they'll start saying their lines or saying the other person's lines, mumbling them as the other one's speaking. And that happened a lot. So I always looked for that as a key thing. And I can't remember who it was. Someone gave me the advice of make sure I really liked all the kids and liked all the actors. And it was terrific advice. And so I did genuinely really like all the kids, and they were great fun. And then we did a lot of rehearsals and spent time together. And Marianne Fay actually stayed on for the kids' rehearsals. And she was so funny. No, Marianne Fay plays the mother.
Oh, yeah.
And she was actually a character called Kylie Mole at the time in the Saturday Company that was huge. And so she was very, very funny, and the kids knew her in that. And so she stayed in rehearsals, and we just had a lot of fun. We rehearsed in a church hall in Richmond, and just, a lot of the time we were just playing and improvising. There weren't that many lines in the script, like mostly the kids just running around in gangs. And so that's what we did. We just played a lot of the time. But we all knew each other terribly well by the time we started filming. And in fact, Rebecca and I went to Luna Park as a bonding experience, and that was just fantastic. And she was so brave, so much braver than me, going on the rides. And so we did all sorts of things like that rather than just talk about the texts. And then I took them to Open Channel because I wanted to show them continuity and how it was important that they did the same action each time, or we wouldn't be able to cut the film together. And they were so film literate. They filmed this scene, and then we went into a cutting room, and where their continuity hadn't been right, they just stood there and said, yeah, but you can cut around that. You can cut here and here and here. So I realised they really understood filmmaking, which was great. And they got along. Like Rebecca was from Sydney, and she stayed with some of the kids when she came down here and their families. So there was a sort of bonding of those children. And they were great kids. And yeah, it's amazing with the restoration. I'm seeing things now on their faces that I couldn't see when it was just 35mm film. And they're just there in the moment all the time. They're amazing.
I meant to ask about Turtle Beach, which you wrote the screenplay for, which Stephen Wallace directed. I just wondered if you had anything to do with Stephen Wallace. His 70s career seems quite interesting with Love Letters from Trafalgar Road and Stir. Mm-hmm. What did you want to direct that film, or
no? I was working at Blanche D'Alpuget.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. After CELIA, the Australian Film Commission asked a few writers to take part in a workshop in Daylesford, and we were sent to this hotel called the Bell, guest house called the Bellinzona, and this American came out and taught us screenwriting, except he was a complete fraud, and he was really strange, and he took us through psychodrama instead. And so we had to sit around in groups of writers and talk about the saddest moment of our lives, the happiest moment of our lives. One was ... I love you, I said. And after the workshops, people did really crazy things. Like people broke up from their husband and they didn't even know they had a problem in their relationship before they went to the workshop. Really crazy things, because it was like deep psychodrama with no training and no taking us out of it gently. And so basically Blanche D'Alpuget was one of the writers, and she was just fantastic. And had such fascinating stories, of course. And so basically after that I went up to Sydney and worked at Roadshow Cook and Carroll, and Turtle Beach was getting adapted and they were having trouble with it. And I really was eager when they asked me if I'd have a stab at it, because I thought Blanche was so fabulous and I loved the book, and that's how I got to do the adaptation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was very much the writer.
Yeah. And you've since sort of turned to writing novels.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you find that in contrast to working on a set or on a screenplay?
Yeah, it's really different. It's really, really different, because on a set you've got all those people you're working with, and like the people I worked with on CELIA, they were just amazing, the cast and the crew, and it was an incredibly good crew. And when you're writing novels, you don't have that. It's very solitary, and so that's not so great, but it can be great, because then you can just go into your own world and do it at your own pace and not have the pressures. I mean, directing is a high pressure job. Writing novels is high pressure once you have deadlines and that sort of thing. But in the early days, if you're just creating a novel, it's a lovely pace that you set yourself. And of course, your ideas don't have to be constrained by budget. Whereas when you're writing for a film, everything is about budget all the time, and locations, and how you're going to actually be able to shoot something in the amount of time that you're going to get.
Yeah.
And so your script is got to be very much a blueprint for that shoot. Whereas when you write novels, it's very much from your imagination, what story you want to tell, and it's really only limited by yourself. So very, very different, actually.
Yeah. Any more questions from the audience, or Zoe?
I'm really curious about the special effects. Did you make suits for the Hobyah?
Yes, Nick Dorning made some fantastic suits, and because it was low budget, we didn't have any budget for proper special effects, so we had to do it all physically. And so I had, from the school reader, you could see how the Hobyahs moved, so I had a very clear image of how the Hobyahs were to move. And I cast a dancer as the hero lead Hobyah, and then other dancers with a pack. And I remember leading them around a tennis court outside this church hall in Richmond, doing the Hobyah steps. So we'd go round and round and round, getting the Hobyah movements. And then Nick Dorning made those fabulous rubber suits and then slimed them up. So it was this revolting slime that was put all over them. And then Bruno, the head Hobyah, he had a big black contact lens put in, one I think actually, when he turns. So there's a great big huge contact lens. So yeah, it was all very physical.
Up to the back,
Miles.
Yeah.
And is there a new film on the horizon?
No, there's not at the moment. No.
Come on, Anne.
I just talk about old films.
Get Emily Blunt back.
It's a lot easier.
Get Emily Blunt back
Get
here.
Emily Blunt. Oh wow, she's got a bit bigger since her second film.
I understand era as well, and also I felt that the hand was a bit deadly, and it's like I just wondered. It occurred to me, having seen this film before and seeing it again now, that it had a bit of the Night Stalker influence in it.
Well, I certainly loved The Night Stalker. It's really interesting. I loved that growing up, watching it, so I'm sure it did influence me because it was a series I really enjoyed.
Darren McGavin.
Yeah, and Tales of the Unexpected, all those. I mean, there were a lot of things in the 70s growing up that had that sort of horror, but not blood and guts horror. It was more mystery horror, wasn't it? Yeah. And so, it's a good point. I think I was influenced by that.
Well, we've got time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap up. Yep,
I
Kitty.
just one, but I'm just thinking about it. I just noticed at the start, Celia's blonde, obviously, and her two parents have very dark hair, and then Alice has got very blonde, luscious hair. Is that a kind of thing to maybe have a bit of a mother figure going on there? Maybe she wasn't connected to her parents in a way. Was that purposeful?
That's a really good point, really good point. And Rebecca used to love joking because I don't think the parents have the right coloured eyes for her blue eyes, she was always telling me. But Yeah, I think there was that, but it was also a bit of an accident because when I wrote the script, I was very much influenced by European movies with children, like Spirit of the Beehive with Anna Torrent. And so I wanted Celia to have short black hair and big dark eyes. And then the casting person said, why don't you meet Rebecca Smart? And I'd seen her in The Shirley with Brian Brown, where she was brilliant. I'd seen her in The Coca-Cola Kid with Greta Scacchi, where she was fantastic. She was more experienced than me when I directed her, because she'd been in those great films. And when I met her, I thought, she's right, she's just Celia, and she really understood the role. She's just a fantastic actor, and always watching, like, she's amazing on set. She was always watching the adults and learning from them, and she'd learnt a lot from Brian Brown and used it. So I thought, yeah, I've just got to have her. But I actually asked her parents if I could cut her long blonde hair and dye it black. And they said, absolutely not. And I'm really glad. I'm so glad, because she's the quintessential 50s kid running around those long summer holidays. And if she'd had the dark hair and the European look, it would have been a different film. And so it was one of those things that was lucky. But I also had always thought of Alice as blonde. And so, yeah, that was by accident that Celia ends up looking more like Alice than her parents, and I think that works really well. But it was one of those happy coincidences. It wasn't intentional, but it's definitely there.
Well, thanks so much, Anne, for coming tonight, and if everyone could give Anne a big round of applause, thanks.
Thanks, Digby, and for having me.
Yeah,
Thank you all for coming very, very much. Thank you.